Chapter 19. A Tense Wait. To the relief of Nancy and the other girls, the caller was Captain Detweiler. They showed him the new cache of jewelry, and he looked grim. "In all my voyages, back and forth across the ocean," he said, "I have never encountered a mystery as outrageous as this one." He found that the long velvet pad with the jewels sewed to it would not fit into his pocket. "I'll have to carry this treasure some other way." Nancy said, "How about asking Rod to bring one of your empty safe deposit cases from the purser's office?" "I'll do that," the captain replied. He went back to cabin 128 and called the assistant purser. Havelock said he would come down as quickly as possible and bring an empty case with him. He arrived a few minutes later and gazed at the new find with disbelief. Then he grinned and looked at Nancy. "I thought you were going to bed and get some sleep before 2 a.m. Here you are, still working on the mystery." The girl detective smiled back. "I never would have forgiven myself if I hadn't finished investigating the trunk and had later learned that we missed all these jewels." The priceless piece of velvet with its contents was put into the small case. Then Nancy brought out a brown beach towel to wrap around it. "This way no one will know what you're carrying," she reasoned, "in case you meet a passenger or a crew member on the way back." "Good idea," Rod Havelock said. "Besides, if the captain and I are attacked again, this case is a beautiful weapon for our defense. I wouldn't like to be hit on the head with sharp metal this heavy." After the two men had left, Nancy glanced at her watch. There was very little time before 2 a.m., but she slept long enough to feel refreshed. Rod picked her up at the appointed time, and the two carried the trunk out into the corridor. No one was in sight, and Rod told her that the watchman was at the far end of the ship. Nancy whispered, "The trunk seems lighter than it did before." "It is," Rod said, "and for a good reason." By the time Nancy and Rod had reached the hold, however, their arms were weary from their burden. Rod unlocked the door, and they carried the trunk inside. "Am I glad that we've got it down here safely," Nancy said with a sigh of relief. "So am I," the assistant purser remarked. "Come on, let's get back upstairs. You must go to bed. No one can get along with as little sleep as you've been getting lately." He escorted her to her cabin, said good night, and told her not to worry about anything. Then he whispered, "I've enjoyed working with you. In my opinion, you're one of the cleverest sleuths in the world. I'll miss playing detective with you, Nancy." The girl smiled and whispered back, "If I ever travel on the Vinschoten again, I'll see if I can dig up a good mystery for you to solve with me." She went into her cabin, undressed quickly, and fell asleep at once. She was awakened at 7 o'clock by the other girls. They were whispering and giggling. "What's so funny?" Nancy asked, rubbing her eyes. George replied, "I was just telling Bess and Nelda that I dreamed someone stole my shoes and left me wooden ones with turned-up toes instead." Nancy chuckled and hurried to dress. Before the girls were ready to leave their cabin, the phone rang. Nancy picked it up. The caller was Al. "Do you girls feel all right after your swim last night?" he asked. "Oh, just fine, Al. Thank you," Nancy replied. "I'm terribly sorry I couldn't jump into the water and save you," the boy went on. "You girls are great divers and swimmers." Nancy laughed. Knowing how came in handy. "Have you eaten yet?" "No," Al replied. "Why don't we all have a farewell breakfast together?" The girls accepted, and in a few minutes went to the dining room, where they met the boys. When they had finished eating, they all said they hoped they could have a reunion sometime. Then Nancy and her friends returned to their cabin. The phone rang again, and Nancy answered the call. "Hello," said a familiar voice. "Ned," she almost shouted. "Oh, it's wonderful to hear from you." Ned told her that Bert Eddleton and Dave Evans, George's and Bess's friends, were with him. "We're driving to New York to pick you up," Ned said. "That's great," Nancy replied. "I'll be glad to have a ride all the way home. But Ned, your car isn't big enough for 3 extra passengers, a brass-bound trunk, and several bags and suitcases." Ned laughed. "My dad recently bought a new station wagon, and we're using that." He went on to say that he and his companions would meet the girls as close to the entrance of the pier as visitors were allowed to come. Bert and Dave spoke to George and Bess, kidding them about taking a leisurely luxury cruise while the boys were working. Then they all said goodbye. At once, Nancy and the other girls began to pack. There was silence for several minutes, but suddenly Nelda cried out. "What's the matter?" Bess asked, startled by the exclamation. Nelda said that the bracelet she had been wearing the night she went overboard was missing. "I know I had it on when I went to the infirmary," she said. "After that, I don't remember." "Oh dear, I hope you haven't lost it," Bess told her. "So do I. My dear grandmother gave it to me, and I prized it highly because she's no longer living." George asked, "Was it terribly valuable?" "No," Nelda replied, "but I loved it for sentimental reasons." George suggested that Nelda call the infirmary and ask if the bracelet had been found there. Nelda did, but was told no one had come across it. Disappointed, she heaved a great sigh. "I guess it's gone forever." Just then there was a knock on the door. Nancy opened it to find Heinrich standing outside. "Did any of you lose a piece of jewelry?" he asked. "Yes, I did," Nelda answered quickly. "A bracelet." "What did it look like?" the steward inquired. "It was a string of tiny enamel flowers in various colors." Heinrich put a hand into a side pocket and pulled out a bracelet. "Is this it?" "Oh, yes, it is," Nelda replied, delighted. "Where did you find it?" Heinrich said that after he had tidied the various cabins, he was putting all the soiled linen into a bundle when the bracelet fell out. He smiled. "I figured it probably belonged to one of you." Nelda thanked him, and he hurried off. When she had closed the door, she said, "I'm ashamed to think that I was ever suspicious of Heinrich. I'm sure this proves his complete innocence of any involvement with the mystery trunk." "You're right," George said, and Nancy and Bess agreed. Late that afternoon, all the luggage except a small quantity, which the girls would carry, was put in the corridor to be picked up later and placed near the large opening of the ship that led directly to the pier. That evening, the girls said goodbye to all their new acquaintances on shipboard and went to bed early. They wanted to be up with the sunrise, since Nancy and Nelda had decided they wanted to be the first passengers off the ship. "I think I won't even bother with breakfast," Nancy said, when they woke the next morning. "Nelda, let's eat some of last night's fruit and the rest of the crackers in this box." It did not take them long to finish the skimpy meal. Then they checked once more with Bess and George on where they would be standing. "Near the inside door leading to the gangplank," George said. "When we see Otto August and his companion file out, we're to fall right behind." "Exactly," said Nancy. "And give me a signal." She and Nelda picked up their purses and hand luggage and left the cabin. Not many people were in the corridors yet, so the girls made good time to the exit where the gangplank would be set up. They had no trouble finding a place at the head of what could be a long line of debarking passengers. The Vinschoten was already at the pier, but the exit door had not yet been opened. Through a window, Nancy and Nelda could see baggage being taken from the hold out onto the dock. "There goes the ND trunk," Nancy whispered. Finally, the exit door to the gangplank was opened. A group of officers marched off the ship first and presented papers to authorities on the pier. Rod Havelock was among them. He paused for a fraction of a second and whispered to the girls, "Good luck." To Nancy and Nelda, it seemed as if their wait was interminable. At last, however, the signal was given for passengers to start debarking. Excited, the girls hurried down the gangplank and onto the pier. They were met by two men. One of them opened his coat and showed a card. He was from the FBI. "Are you Nancy Drew and Nelda Detweiler?" he asked. "Yes," Nancy answered. "I'm Mr. Carson, and this is my assistant. We want to question you about a theft." End of chapter 19.